Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Griselda Blanco's story doesn't start with grandeur. It starts in the backstreets of Colombia, where survival meant doing whatever it took to make it through the day. Born into poverty in 1943, Griselda's childhood was anything but a fairy tale. By the age of 10, she was already caught in the brutal world of crime, where a woman had to fight harder than anyone to carve out a name. Her early years were spent dodging violence in the slums of Barranquilla. Griselda wasn't just a product of her environment, she was a force to be reckoned with, already showing the kind of cold determination that would later make her infamous. The streets shaped her, hardened her, but it was her sharp mind that set her apart. While others scrambled for scraps, she learned the art of deception and manipulation. By the time she was in her early 20s, Griselda had already crossed paths with powerful figures, and the cocaine trade was beginning to dominate the streets of Colombia. What came next was inevitable. She would rise, and she would rise fast. The world of cocaine wasn't for the faint-hearted. But Griselda wasn't like other people. She didn't just want a piece of the pie, she wanted to control it all. It wasn't long before she moved to Miami, a city buzzing with money, heat, and crime, the perfect playground for someone like her. In Miami, Griselda quickly noticed a gap in the market. The U.S. was hungry for cocaine, and the cartels were feeding that demand. But there were cracks in the operation, weak links she could exploit. So, she did what came naturally. She infiltrated the scene, first as a small-time dealer and then as a mastermind pulling the strings behind the scenes. It didn't take long for her to climb the ladder. She was ruthless, smart, and calculated. She had a way of making deals that no one could refuse, leveraging fear and charm in equal measure. Her network grew, and so did her power. Soon, she controlled one of the most profitable cocaine routes in the world, from Colombia straight to Miami, the cocaine capital of the United States. But as Griselda's empire expanded, so did the danger. The heat was on, and every step she took was like walking a tightrope. Griselda Blanco wasn't just a part of the drug trade, she redefined it. By the mid-1970s, she had become a shadow ruler in the underworld, a woman who commanded respect, fear, and loyalty. Her empire wasn't built on brute force alone. It was built on precision. Griselda understood the intricacies of smuggling, the planes, the boats, the hidden compartments. She ran a slick operation, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Her operation expanded beyond Miami. She controlled distribution chains, creating an efficient network that stretched up to New York City, infiltrating the East Coast market. Her methods were cold, but effective. Griselda's ability to avoid capture while expanding her business was nothing short of impressive. And in a world where men held the reins, she proved that a woman could rule with an iron fist. She wasn't just feared by the people beneath her, she also had the cops, the DEA, and the FBI on her radar. But every move they made, she was already 3 steps ahead. To Griselda, the game was about outsmarting those who thought they could catch her. Her reputation spread quickly, and soon, the streets of Miami whispered one name: La Madrina, the godmother of cocaine. But success always comes with its own set of enemies. Griselda Blanco's rise to power wasn't without its sacrifices. She had built an empire of cocaine, but maintaining control over it came at a steep cost. Her ruthlessness became notorious. She didn't just eliminate competition, she erased anyone who threatened her throne. If someone crossed her, they disappeared without a trace. Fear was her currency, and she wielded it like a weapon. But behind the power, there was a darker side. Griselda's personal life was as turbulent as her criminal one. She was a mother, but her children were often distant figures in her world, overshadowed by her obsession with control and her fear of losing it. She had 3 sons, but her cold, calculating nature made it difficult for her to connect with them. Her own family began to feel like just another piece of her empire to manage. As her empire grew, so did her enemies. Rival cartels, law enforcement, and even her own associates began to feel the heat. Griselda trusted few people, and even fewer could stomach the way she ruled. But for her, betrayal was worse than death. She became paranoid, constantly watching over her shoulder, knowing that the higher she climbed, the harder she would fall. The tipping point was near. Griselda's empire, once a well-oiled machine, began to show cracks. The law had finally caught up with her, but it wasn't the DEA or the FBI that would bring her down, it was her own people. Trust had always been a fragile thing for Griselda, and now, her paranoia was starting to consume her. She had enemies on the inside, people who were once loyal, now plotting against her. In the early 1980s, the pressure mounted. Her network began to unravel as her associates turned informants, desperate to save themselves from the inevitable heat. One by one, they started to talk. Griselda's careful maneuvers had always kept her out of prison, but this time, her empire was crumbling from within. It didn't help that the feds were closing in, their surveillance tighter than ever. After years of operating under the radar, Griselda's world was now full of eyes. She knew she couldn't keep up the game forever, but the idea of losing everything she'd built was more terrifying than anything else. Her phone was tapped, her movements tracked, and her inner circle was no longer loyal. In the end, it wasn't a rival cartel that took her down, it was the weight of her own ambition, and the enemies she'd made along the way. Griselda Blanco's world collapsed quickly. In 1985, after years of evading the law, she was finally arrested, not for the cocaine empire she'd built, but for murder. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge her with ordering the killings of rivals and anyone who threatened her reign. It wasn't just a handful of bodies, but a trail of destruction that stretched across cities, across borders. She had been a force of nature, but now she was a prisoner. Her arrest was a spectacle. Headlines screamed her name, and she became the symbol of the violent and ruthless drug trade that had once flourished in Miami. The woman who had ruled with fear now sat in a jail cell, her empire shattered. For the first time in years, she was vulnerable, and the streets of Miami, which once whispered her name with awe and fear, now saw her as just another fallen queen. In court, her defense was as cold as the woman herself. She didn't show remorse, instead, she maintained the same steely composure she'd had throughout her rise. But the damage was done. She was convicted of several murders, and the sentence was harsh, a life behind bars. Even as she served time, Griselda's name lingered in the air, like the scent of the cocaine she once trafficked. Her legacy was one of blood and power, but it was also a reminder of how the empire she built came crashing down. Griselda Blanco spent her years in prison in a way that mirrored her life on the outside, isolated and always on guard. Unlike most criminals who cracked under the weight of their downfall, she adapted. The same cold calculation that had made her a powerful force in the cocaine world kept her alive behind bars. Prison wasn't a defeat for Griselda, it was just another part of the game. She kept to herself, remaining distant from the other inmates. She was a queen without a crown, a woman who had once commanded respect on the streets and now sat behind concrete walls. There were whispers about her even inside, the cocaine queen, a legend who was both feared and admired by those who knew of her. But time, as it does to everyone, wore her down. Griselda's health began to deteriorate. She was no longer the woman who had once run Miami with an iron fist. Her sharp mind was still there, but the prison walls had a way of breaking down even the toughest individuals. She spent her years mostly in solitary confinement, with few visitors and even fewer people who truly cared. Yet, even in her isolation, the legacy of her power remained. Stories of Griselda Blanco, the woman who ruled with blood and cocaine, continued to circulate, even in the darkest corners of the system. Griselda Blanco's final years were marked by a quiet reflection, far from the empire she once controlled. After spending nearly 2 decades in U.S. prisons, her sentence was reduced, and in 2004, she was released on parole. She was a woman aged by time, no longer the ruthless figure who had once ruled the streets. Now, she was just another old woman trying to survive in a world that had long since moved on without her. She returned to Colombia, the place where it all began. But even in her homeland, Griselda was a relic of a past life. The cocaine trade had shifted, the cartels had evolved, and Griselda's name no longer carried the weight it once did. She was no longer feared, she was simply another forgotten legend in a history filled with many others. Her time in Colombia was quiet, spent mostly out of the public eye. She tried to reconnect with her sons, but the distance between them had only grown. Griselda's cold nature had left its mark, and the bonds of family were forever strained. She had spent her life building an empire, but in the end, it was the emptiness of that empire that defined her. In 2012, Griselda Blanco was killed in a drive-by shooting outside a butcher shop in Medellin. It was a violent end, but it seemed fitting for a woman who had lived her life in the shadows of violence. Her death was swift, almost poetic, a woman who had built her world on blood, dying by it. Griselda Blanco's death marked the end of an era in the cocaine trade, but her legacy was far from forgotten. While the world moved on, her name still echoed through the corridors of criminal history. She had been a pioneer, the one who laid the groundwork for the modern drug trade in the U.S. She had risen from the slums of Colombia to create an empire that stretched across continents, and in the process, she had changed the game forever. Despite her violent downfall, Griselda's story became one of myth and legend. She wasn't just the cocaine queen, she was a symbol of ambition and ruthlessness, a reminder that anyone, even a woman in a man's world, could dominate if they were willing to do whatever it took. People talked about her with awe and fear, seeing her not just as a criminal, but as a woman who had defied the odds to build something no one else could. Her impact didn't just stop at the drug trade. Griselda's life and death became a cautionary tale, an example of how unchecked ambition could lead to both ultimate power and inevitable destruction. For many, she was the embodiment of what happens when a person, regardless of their gender, pushes too far, and how a legacy built on blood is never easily forgotten. As we look back on the life of Griselda Blanco, it's clear that her story is one of both triumph and tragedy. She rose from the dust of Colombia's poorest streets to control an empire worth millions, with a name feared and respected by criminals and authorities alike. She changed the cocaine trade forever, making connections and cutting deals that no one thought possible. But her story also serves as a powerful reminder of the cost of power and ambition. Griselda Blanco was a woman who had everything and lost it all. Her success was built on the blood of rivals, friends, and even family. In the end, the empire she'd worked so tirelessly to build became nothing more than a crumbling monument to her own ambition. Her downfall wasn't just a consequence of the law catching up to her, but of the trust she'd burned, the lives she destroyed, and the paranoia that had ultimately isolated her. In the quest for dominance, Griselda forgot the simple truth: no one stays at the top forever. Her story isn't one to romanticize, but it's one to learn from. It shows that crime, power, and violence can only take you so far before they come crashing down. And in the end, the price of ruling with blood is often far too high. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more gangster stories like this one.